lecture will be filmed, as all our lectures are, and you can see them on our YouTube page, which is RI 1916 Committee Lectures. Tonight, we are so excited to have Tim Hoyt back. Some of us have heard him before. Very knowledgeable and a very electrifying speaker, and we were just talking earlier how impressed we all are that he's going to talk now for 45 minutes and not look at a note. I couldn't do it for 5 minutes here, but anyway, Tim, take it away. People in the back, if you can't hear, raise your hand and we'll put a microphone in his hand.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you all. It is always a pleasure to be back here with the 1916 committee. Whether you know it or not, I really appreciate your allowing me to come and speak to you. You allow me to test out ideas for projects that I'm working on, which will eventually lead to a book. And it's really useful for me not to speak to an academic audience, because academic audiences are very focused on very small things that are very important to individuals. And I'm trying to communicate to a much broader audience. So when the book comes out, your committee will be mentioned in the foreword, because I really do appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. I have to start, and I forgot to put it on the slide, I have to start by saying I am an employee of the US government, but what I'm going to talk about tonight is not the policy of the US government, the US Navy, the Department of Defense, the US Naval War College, or any other institution of the US government. These are simply my opinions and my knowledge extracted from years of study. With that, I can now say virtually anything I want and not get into it. Next slide, please. Okay, tonight I want to talk a little bit about the end of the Irish Revolution, and this has become important in the last decade or so. It's been about 100 years since many issues in Ireland occurred that led to Ireland's independence, or at least the creation of the Irish Free State and partition, which also led to Northern Ireland. The government of Ireland has held every year a series of conferences dealing with the centenaries of these debates. But as you can see, with the end of the Civil War in 1923, it's now 2024, and it looks like those centenary meetings are going to die off. But over the course of doing the research, and over the course of talking with colleagues in Ireland and the United States, it's become evident to me that there are things that Americans can contribute to the academic and the political debate in Ireland that are a little bit unique because we're detached from it. And so tonight, that's one of the things I'm going to be trying to do, is to test out some ideas that I think are important, because there is something Americans can contribute to the ongoing not only study of Ireland, but also to the political and peace process in Ireland as well. Next slide. What makes the Irish case particularly interesting is, first off, it happens in the early 20th century. Now, there's a huge wave of anti-colonial political unrest after 1945, because the Second World War, France is defeated and then comes back. The British Empire is basically bankrupted, and in the period from the 1945 until the late 1980s, there are a whole series of revolutions in the developing world as states move from being colonies to a post-colonial world. Ireland does this in 1922, and that's different. We tend not to look at it the same way, but knowing some of the things that we know now about post-colonial struggles elsewhere in the world can help inform us as to what went wrong in Ireland and what went right, as to things that happened in Ireland that might be unique or that might be replicable at some point in the future as other nations try to emerge and develop themselves. There are two pillars of Irish nationalism, right? The first is constitutional politics. Ireland was incorporated into the United Kingdom in 1801 through the Act of Union. So the United Kingdom at that point became the United Kingdom of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, right? However, once Ireland joined the United Kingdom was trying to entice Irish people to become more full members and to enact political reforms to make Ireland more like the rest of the United Kingdom. And this included democratic politics, which led to constitutional nationalism. First, the Catholic Emancipation, which happened in the early 19th century under the leadership of Daniel O'Connell. The Repeal movement, which came at about the same time as the Chartist movement in England, as an effort to gain democratic status for all of the citizens of Ireland. It failed. Home Rule under Charles Stewart Parnell, and then later under John Redmond, became the focus of parliamentary politics for the Irish members of Parliament in Westminster from about 1873 until 1918 or so. Those were all constitutional efforts, and they did make some progress. That's important to know. Catholics got the vote. They didn't have the vote in 1801. Catholics who had sufficient land and property to qualify the way that Protestants and other people did got the vote in 1829 through constitutional means. Two home rule bills were killed by conservative vetoes in the House of Lords and the House of Commons, but the third was passed in 1912 and would have given some self-government and autonomy to Ireland. Again, this was done through constitutional politics. So there was this tradition that democracy could have an impact. The other side of Irish nationalism is the physical force tradition. All right? This was a minority view. However, it was rooted in the republicanism of the United Irishmen, 1798, a rebellion. 1803, Robert Emmet tried to raise up a rebellion in downtown Dublin. It didn't go well. In 1848, during the famine, the young Irelanders tried to rise up again and overthrow British rule. That was not successful. The Irish Republican Brotherhood was formed in 1858. The Fenian rebellions from 1866 until about 1870 occurred both in North America and in the British Isles. So there was a Fenian rebellion in Ireland in 1867. There were armed attacks in England and Wales in 1867. And from 1866 until 1870, Irish Americans invaded Canada on several different occasions. So these were efforts by armed groups to somehow seize territory that would give them bargaining leverage with the British government and gain more autonomy or self-governance for the Irish people. The Land League in 1880 was a violent movement that worked in cooperation with the Home Rule movement in order to change land tenure in Ireland. And from 1880 until 1923, the ownership of land in Ireland changed fundamentally. So in that case, a combination of violence and political influence had long-term impacts on the social and economic conditions in Ireland. And last but not least, the Invincibles and Dynamitards were terrorist groups. The Invincibles slaughtered a couple of British officials with butcher knives, and the Dynamitards came over and did an early dynamite campaign in Ireland and particularly in the United Kingdom, the rest of the United Kingdom, in the 1880s. Those movements petered out by about 1885. But by the time you reach the 20th century, both of these traditions are pretty firmly embedded, and both have support. Generally, much more support for constitutional politics than for physical force, but the physical force tradition continued in Ireland. Next slide, please. Now, the way the British responded to this is important. They responded with reform as well as with repression. And part of the reason they do this, and here we come back to America, because at the end, it's all about us, right? There was something that happened in America between like 1775 and 1783, and it was kind of important. And the British realized that, when they had restive colonial populations that wanted political participation, they might want to pay attention to it. And it is not a coincidence that in 1783, as the British are signing a peace that recognizes the right of the United States to exist, they also resurrect the Irish Parliament in Dublin, because they are thinking, if it happened in America, it could happen in Ireland. And from 1783 until about 1798, this Parliament exists. It's not terribly powerful, but it's a symbol. And it's an effort on the part of the British to say, well, if you want to say no taxation without representation, here in Ireland you have representation. This is not enough to stave off revolution. The French Revolution occurs in 1789. The idea of republicanism sweeps across Europe. It reaches Ireland, where, again, you have Wolfe Tone and others, the United Irishmen, form a republican movement that is prepared to ally with France and liberate Ireland by force. What do you think the name of the guy that the British go to repress this movement is?
Peel, Robert Peel.
Nope, a little early for Peel. Lord Cornwallis. Cornwallis is the butcher of Ireland. He took the wrong, he felt like England took the wrong path in America. They used too light a hand. So when they repressed the United Irishmen, Cornwallis kills 40,000 people. And then they start hanging rebels all over the island, right? So the British tried both reform and coercion in the run-up to Union. And then with the Act of Union, they're trying to sort of incorporate Ireland in and convert it in some way. And one of the ways they do this is with reform. You end the penal laws, you disestablish the Church of Ireland. Some of you folks are probably old enough to remember when we were young, the longest word in the English language was anti-disestablishmentarianism.
Oh, yeah.
That is what this is about. If you opposed the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland, you were practicing anti-disestablishmentarianism. That's your takeaway for the night, okay? They also begin land reform in response to the Land League. The Liberal Party is the one that is supporting home rule bills. I mean, there are real efforts from parts of the British political community at various times to offer reforms that will make participation in the empire and membership in the United Kingdom palatable to the Irish people, right? Especially important, as we'll see, I think, are local elections, which are finally locked in 1898. But the British also maintain a legal system that can resort to special powers for crises and revolts. The Royal Irish Constabulary, which in the countryside is nothing like the London Bobbies. They are an armed paramilitary police force. And the Dublin Metropolitan Police are formed in multiple divisions, but the most important one is G Division, which is an armed division of about 60 detectives, but they work on political crimes. Now the DMP otherwise is mostly unarmed. They are literally bobbies. But G Division, because it works on political crimes, gets weapons and becomes a major target for Michael Collins during the War of Independence. Next slide, please. So, we're going to jump forward a few years, because I've told you more about the War of Independence than you really need to know in previous lectures. I'd be glad to answer questions on it, however. How and why did the revolution end? Right? It moved roughly from 1912 to 1923, but it seems to sort of end very quickly. When we look at that, one way to think about it, it certainly has something to do with the Anglo-Irish Treaty, right? The treaty that is negotiated by Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith and 3 other emissaries in London, and which they sign in December 1921, and bring back to Dublin, where they present it to the cabinet. Eamon de Valera is the head of the Irish Dáil, the Irish Assembly for all practical purposes. De Valera doesn't want to consider it, but they have a cabinet vote, and it is by 4 votes to 3, de Valera's wishes are overruled. So the cabinet decides we're going to put this in front of the Dáil, the entire assembly, and debate it and have a vote and decide whether we are going to accept this treaty or not. And they have that debate, and it goes on for a couple of weeks. They take a break at Christmas, and on January 7th, they finally hold the noes count, and by 64 to 57, the Dáil, who were elected in 1921 by the Irish people, the Dáil vote in favor of the treaty. At that point, things start to move in some fairly interesting and rapid ways. There are some traditional narratives about what's going on here, and these are drawn both from historians, but also from political debates that occur in both Ireland and the North at various periods as people look back on their history and try and figure out what it means. And the four descriptions that I'm going to go through fairly briefly now are the idea that what happened in the Civil War, which follows the treaty by about 6 months, what happened in the Civil War was about terrorists and a legitimate government. And that narrative emerged fairly quickly in the Civil War. And it's a narrative that was coined, unsurprisingly, by the government, which wanted to say, we are legitimate, we have been voted for, we have a treaty that we have to uphold that was approved through democratic means, and we're going to move forward with that. And then anybody who opposed that with violence, they called terrorists or irregulars, right? Now the counter narrative that's occurring at the same time from people who oppose the treaty is a narrative of the folks who signed the treaty have betrayed the Republic. The Republic of 1916 that was born out of the blood of heroes in Dublin in the Easter Rising, and then was the party platform of the Sinn Féin party when it ran for election in 1918 and received 73 of 105 seats in Ireland, so roughly 70% of the support of the Irish voting population. And then was confirmed in the 1921 election when all of the Sinn Féin candidates, 124 in what is now, will soon become the Free State, all were elected, right? So they're saying the voters voted for the Republic, and these corrupt politicians are betraying the Republic and therefore betraying the will of the voters. These are intensely political positions, right? And you have to recognize them right away. There's truth in both of them, which I'll go on to talk about in a few minutes. But that's very much the consideration of the debate over the Civil War up until the time of the Troubles. And when the Troubles happen, you begin to see another debate emerge. And it starts in the Irish Republic, the 26 counties that had been the Free State. The government of the Irish Republic doesn't want to be associated with the Provisional IRA. But at the same time, they are inherently linked with the Provisional IRA because the two major parties in Ireland both emerged from the War of Independence and from the IRA. Right? Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil both emerged from, their initial leaders were members of the IRA. De Valera was a commandant that becomes the head of Fianna Fáil. De Valera was a commandant in 1916 at the Easter Rising. Michael Collins becomes the head of the party that becomes Fine Gael. He's the head of the pro-treaty government. He was director of intelligence for the IRA. He was Minister of Finance for the Dáil. But there's an incredible tangling here, and the Irish government doesn't want to be closely linked with the Provisional IRA almost as soon as the Provisional IRA becomes really active, 1970, early 1971. So they come up with a new interpretation of what happened in the Civil War. And they say, no. What really happened in the Civil War was there could have been anarchy. And there were a whole bunch of militarists who only cared about violence. And they were idealists. And they had no idea of how to run a state or make a state work or how to do politics. But they were powerful and they opposed the treaty and they had more men and guns. And the government managed to save democracy. And that's a narrative. It's a narrative that comes both out of Southern politicians and increasingly now, for a period of about 20 years, out of Irish historians who are just, they're looking at the Civil War in a different way. And they are actually called revisionists. Now, in some places, revisionism isn't a bad thing. In academe, usually it's a curse, because it means you're taking whatever everybody believes and you're challenging it. In this case, they're doing it in a way, and they get called out for it in the 90s. I mean, the Provisional IRA and Sinn Féin called them out for it earlier, but in the 90s, in academe, you get a counter-argument, which is what happened was actually a counter-revolution. That there was a revolution that occurred in Ireland from 1919 to 1921. There was a virtual republic, it was left-leaning, it could have created something new and genuine, and instead, the supporters of the treaty, in order to prop up the treaty and their government, reached back to conservative elites and locked Ireland back in its past for a generation, right? Women's rights died, right? Many progressive ideas, workers' rights, things like that, tabled for decades. So that's kind of the counter argument, which is, on the one hand, somebody's saying, well, this is about militarism and democracy, and someone else is saying, no, it's about reaching back to the church, reaching back to the bankers, reaching back to the Anglo-Irish elites because they have money in order to prop up the state and win the Civil War. Next slide. Now, what I'm going to try and do is walk through each of these fairly quickly because my answer is a little different. I think there is truth in all of these, but I think we also can gain some advantage from hindsight and from distance. And being an American living in the 21st century, I have both hindsight and distance, but also we can reflect on the post-colonial experience of other countries and compare that to what happened in Ireland and see if the outcomes in Ireland were relatively better than they might have been. Next slide. So, the terrorism versus legitimate government debate. It's crafted by pro-treaty forces. It's painting Republicans as fanatical who preferred their ideals to the will of the Irish people. The provisional government is established after the treaty is approved. And it's headed by Michael Collins. Right? Now, Michael Collins, most people can't really accuse him of not being a Republican because he's the head of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. He's the director of intelligence for the IRA. He created the assassination squad that terrorized police in Dublin. The provisional government takes over normal government functions, first under Collins, and then when the Civil War breaks out, Collins becomes the head of the military, the commander-in-chief. So Arthur Griffith, another leading figure in Sinn Féin, briefly becomes the head of state. And then after both Collins and Griffith die in August of 1922, Griffith from a stroke, Collins in a gunfight, William Cosgrave takes over. But they do things normal governments do, and they have to do them on the timeline, because once they accept the treaty, they have a year to put things in order, because on December 6th, 1922, the Free State of Ireland, a dominion, is going to come into existence. A dominion, at the time, is it has a special status in the British Empire. And the best way to get at the special status is to tell you what the other dominions are. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, Newfoundland. Right? Those are the other 5 dominions. They have autonomy. They have their individual constitutions, but for each of them, the constitution includes an oath of fealty to the monarchy, because the monarchy is what binds the empire together. The treaty makes Ireland a dominion. That means Ireland is still part of the empire. It will have self-governance and autonomy, but within limits. And there is an oath to the king, which is carefully managed to make it as inoffensive as possible, and they fail. Right? The oath to the king that comes in the treaty itself is actually written by the leadership of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. They say, if we have to make an oath to the king, this one's the least offensive one we can, and we might be able to make it work. It turned out they were wrong. The oath to the king is a big part of the reason the Civil War breaks out. Irish patriots don't want anything to do with the monarch. They create a national army, they hold elections, they create a Gardaí, a new police force that is unarmed. Right? These are state functions, though, and they're all important in moving towards that December 6, 1922 date. But each time they move in that direction, they also assert more control over Irish society, build more support from the Irish public, and alienate people who are opposed to the treaty more and more, because they're beginning to look more and more like the government. Now, this government continues with elections after the war, and it does fairly well in elections in the 1920s, as we'll see, and then eventually, and this is one of the remarkable things about the Irish Revolution, the side that loses the Civil War in 1923 And there is no doubt that De Valera and the IRA lost the Civil War, although they did not surrender, and there was never a peace treaty or anything like that. They dumped arms and quit. In 1932, they are elected as a party and come into government. So less than 10 years after they're defeated in a civil war, they use a constitutional process to come into power in government and continue pursuing some of the things that they wanted to do, which was undermining the treaty. So it's a very interesting story. Next slide, please. The foundation of this narrative is Kevin O'Higgins. O'Higgins was one of the members of the provisional government. He's got this great line: the provisional government was simply 8 young men in the city hall, standing amidst the ruins of one administration, with the foundation of another not yet laid, and with wild men screaming through the keyhole. It sounds pretty good. It's not really what was going on, but it's a good soundbite. Next slide. There's a counter argument here. And as you see, each time I give you one of these arguments, I'm going to give you a counter argument because it's important to try and keep some perspective. The anti-treaty guys were actually surprisingly non-terrorist in the Civil War. They actually didn't do... They were fighting a civil war. Civilians were in danger. That does not mean, however, that they deliberately targeted civilians. They had respect for non-combatant immunity as much as they could. They didn't attack the unarmed Gardaí, but they would attack troops and other members of security forces and political leaders of the pro-treaty groups. They did attempt to create economic pressures that would overthrow the government, but in general, they looked a lot more legitimate than many groups that we would call terrorists in the post-1945 environment. They had more respect for civilian life, and they seem in many ways generally reluctant to kill other Irishmen unless those other Irishmen were actively engaged in supporting the government. Members of the government, by the way, collaborated with some of these guys they were calling terrorists, both before the Civil War broke out, and even as the Civil War was going on, there were back-channel contacts between these guys, partly because they had been on the same side in the Irish War of Independence just a year before. And they knew one another, and they were always trying to figure out, isn't there some way we can turn this thing off? So this idea that the terrorists were somehow, just incalculably bad, and the government was legitimate, there's an awful lot of overlap here. And it doesn't really answer everything for us. The state, by the way, practiced terror and coercion as well. They executed over 80 prisoners. They instituted martial courts to try prisoners. They had 12,000 people in jail by mid-1923 for being associated with the Republican movement. So the state was coercive. In academia, sometimes we call that state terror. Not nearly, as we'll see in a little bit, as coercive as some other states in other revolutions at this time, but still coercive. The government had bloody hands. Next slide, please. Okay, the counter-narrative is that the Republic was betrayed. This is Cathal Brugha, who was wounded something like 20 times in the Easter Rising and survived. And then he became a leader of the Republican movement during the War of Independence. He becomes a close follower of De Valera. He dies tragically in Dublin at the beginning of the Civil War. There are a couple of different versions of this story. There are some people who say that the army was betrayed by corrupt politicians. In almost any country at some point you can find people who are willing to say that the army's been betrayed by corrupt politicians. But it was an argument, right? The army, many people thought that the army was winning the war against Britain. But then there was a truce, and then there was a treaty, and nobody understands why that all happened, right? The army was somehow undercut by politicians who then created a treaty that these people don't like, that betrays the Republic. There are some who blame Collins specifically, either because he wants absolute power, which he came fairly close to achieving in July 1922, as we'll see, or because of British bribes or some other incentive. The third version was that old Sinn Féin, the politicians who were pretty ineffective in the early 1900s and early 1910s for the Sinn Féin party, had somehow asserted authority over the young Republicans who had led the movement, fought the war, and should have been reaping the benefits and should have been leading the movement. But instead, Arthur Griffith and others came in and became moderates. And then the key part of the argument here is that there was a democratic mandate for a republic. It was voted in twice by the Irish people, and it was betrayed in the face of British coercion. And that, if we can look at the last 4 words, face of British coercion, that is undeniably true. At the peace treaty discussions, the day that the treaty was signed, David Lloyd George stood up and said, "You have a choice. Sign the treaty or face a terrible war." That is coercion. And the British could have backed it up. It's not clear they wanted to, but they certainly could have backed it up. They were prepared to put as many as 100,000 troops in Ireland, which they'd only had about 60,000 during the War of Independence, so that's a considerable reinforcement. And to really begin taking the gloves off. The general in command of the Irish forces, General Sir Neville Macready, asked the cabinet, and he said, "Are you sure that this is what you want to do? Because we could be shooting hundreds of people a week." Okay? That's a big jump in violence if they actually were going to carry it out. About 2,000 people died in the War of Independence, which lasted for, if you include the Eastern Rising, almost 5 years. Hundreds of people a week is going to be a much more violent experience. Next slide. Counter-argument. Well, the first thing is, the Republic was never an option. Whatever the advocates of the Republic say, it was never an option. Because the Constitution, by the treaty, is a Dominion Constitution. It has no space for a republic. But even more so, the head of the anti-treaty movement, Eamon de Valera, knew within weeks after the truce was declared that Lloyd George would never consider a republic, because he went and he met with him. And then he had an extensive correspondence. He knew exactly what the guidelines were. He knew they were going to get Dominion status and nothing more. But at the same time, defenders of the Republic say, well, we had a republic. It didn't really have much enforcement power, but they had a republic. They had a government that was an Irish government. They had an army that was an Irish army. They wanted more of that somehow, right? The majority of the people who voted for the treaty were activist Republicans. This is something that isn't captured in any of the narratives. 124 people were elected in 1921. They were all elected unopposed. Nobody ran against them. And they were hand-selected by the leadership of Sinn Féin and the Irish Republican Brotherhood. These were tested, true, devoted Republicans. They were faced with a choice that was very difficult, which was either go back to war or accept this treaty that doesn't give you everything you want, but it gives you a lot more than home rule, right? It gives you Dominion status. You're like Canada. It gives you control over 26 counties. It gives you your own army. It gives you your own parliament. You can collect taxes. You act like an independent government inside the empire. Is that a half full glass, a half empty glass? That's what the Civil War debate is about. Some feel we should continue fighting till we get the Republic. Others feel like, and this was how Collins disguised this argument, he said, look, if we take this, it's a stepping stone towards a Republic, because from this, we can build an Irish nation. The Irish nation can grow and become stronger, and we can take on the rest of the project a little bit later. That's a key part of the debate. The Republic never really existed. There were departments that functioned. Ministry of Finance actually was pretty good, partly because Collins ran it. There were Republican courts, which functioned pretty well in 1919 and 1920, and began to recede in 1921 because the police and the army began to really crack down on them. The IRA wasn't going to win a military victory. This came out in the debates. And it's a sad statement to have to make, but the IRA, in July of 1921, they had 600 rifles. They were fighting the British army that had just won World War I, right? Military victory was not going to be easy. Now, by the end of the truce period, by the time that the debates are going on, they have about 3,000 rifles. That's still not going to be enough against a British army that has artillery and air power and armor. If it's determined to fight, you're fighting at bad odds. And Richard Mulcahy, who is the commander, the chief of staff of the Irish Republican Army, says in the treaty debates, the treaty gives us more than we could win if we fought. And that's a strong argument for why you look at the glass as half full. If we continue fighting, we will lose a bunch of this. We can't even take a large police station by force, is what Mulcahy says. It's a brutal assessment, but it's correct. I mean, this is stuff I kind of do for a living. It's my day job. And they would have had real trouble fighting. You could fight a guerrilla war, they could continue to resist, but to defeat the British army would have been really, really difficult, probably impossible. Next slide. Okay, now we fast forward and look at the 1970s. Militarism versus democracy, right? They are actually jumping on this idea that the old Sinn Féin politicians kind of took over, and the rational people, the politically savvy people, took charge of this movement and got it as much as they could, right? And in difficult circumstances where they weren't going to get everything they wanted from Britain, putting these guys in charge meant that they got a lot more than the hotheads would have gotten. It also highlights a Republican aversion to normal politics, which existed in the War of Independence, but is highlighted after the Civil War and continues for decades. Where the IRA says Sinn Féin is completely subordinate to us. They're a mouthpiece. In fact, from 1926 until 1948, the IRA doesn't even associate with Sinn Féin. They allow it back into the fold in 1948 as they're preparing for another campaign. But they basically say, politics is dumb. The reason we fight is because we have to fight. And we will fight because we need to fight, and we will continue fighting. It's a kind of a naive view. It's a reversal of normal civil-military relations. And it doesn't really begin to change until just before the Troubles. You start to see more Republicans getting more interested in politics, first in the official IRA, and then later in provisional Sinn Féin. But one of the pieces of evidence of Republican aversion to normal politics is that they sidelined De Valera for most of the year. They basically don't pay any attention to him because all they want to do is fight the British. And everything De Valera is trying to do, as we'll see in a few minutes, they don't assist in that. It highlights Republican statements that hint at a military dictatorship. Again, this resonates in the 1970s with people looking back at the history of the IRA in the 30s and the 40s and 50s. And it's about constitutional pragmatists versus violent separatists, right? This great Sean Moylan, who became a Fianna Fáil MP and a mover and shaker in the Fianna Fáil party. But this quote kind of captures it. It wasn't a question of being able to win with us. It was that we were right and we couldn't surrender being right. It didn't matter if we lost. We couldn't quit because we were right. That's the portrayal in this debate of the IRA. Next slide, please. And this is Rory O'Connor, who was one of the leaders of the anti-treaty IRA. If the government goes wrong, it must take the consequences. If the Doyles, the government of the country, were in revolt against it. When he's asked if the IRA were considering a military dictatorship, he said, you can take it that way if you like. Now, the way that's phrased, it might be flippant, but it went into the papers and people took it really seriously. Okay? Next slide. However, there's problems with this too. The supposedly democratic side had an awful lot of militarism in it, an awful lot. And this again dates back to that sort of physical force versus constitutional debate in Irish nationalism. There's a belief that the physical force people usually believe that the constitutional process will always lose. And so they're always looking for ways to use physical force. Collins commits to the Northern Campaign. This is when he's the head of the provisional government and he's supposed to be making the treaty work with the British government, and the treaty says that there's a Northern Ireland and a Southern Ireland, and Collins is covertly working with the anti-treaty IRA to overthrow Northern Ireland. Everybody follow that? Right? No, I mean, he is absolutely two-faced on some of these issues, and that's, fair enough. He was a dedicated Republican. He was trying to find ways to work the legal side and the illegal side. There's a refusal to confront the anti-treaty IRA until June. Griffith wants it happening in March, because there are disputes as the British Army withdraws. There are disputes over the garrisons and the arsenals, right? The British Army leaves, and it leaves behind a whole bunch of rifles. Who gets the rifles? The anti-treaty IRA or the pro-treaty IRA? There are gunfights. People are killed. Griffith wants to go in with force hard in March. And Collins says, no, we're still trying to work this out. They continue negotiations with the anti-treaty IRA all the way up to the beginning of the Civil War, which the government launches in an attack on the Four Courts. There's a triumvirate of military leaders running the country until Collins' death. This is really interesting. There's an election. At the end of June, the second Doyle is supposed to be dismissed formally, and the third Doyle, which was just elected, is supposed to enter into office and take authority. The Civil War starts on June 28th. Collins immediately steps in and says, we are not going to have the third Doyle meet yet. This is an emergency. And he and Mulcahy and another general named O'Sullivan, all three are, Collins and O'Sullivan are leaders in the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Mulcahy's status with the IRB is murky. He was once a member. He seems to be everywhere that decisions are made, but he always insisted that he was not a member. So I don't know what to say about that. But this triumvirate runs the country from July 1st until Collins' death on August 22nd. And they don't allow the elected government to meet. That kind of looks militarist. Collins is the commander-in-chief. He has almost indisputed power. Mulcahy's still meeting with anti-treaty leaders, including De Valera, up through September. Right, so the military is acting at a minimum independently of government oversight, and perhaps acting in ways that might threaten the legitimacy or control of the government. There are, of course, emergency declarations, military tribunals, and executions. And then the reprisal killings of Rory O'Connor, Liam Mellows, Joe McKelvey, and Rory Barrett on the 7th of December, 1922. These are the most illegal act of the provisional government. There is just no doubt about it. Even the archbishops consider it unjustifiable from a moral point of view. So this government looks, yes, it has democratic trappings, but at times it looks very militarist in its own right. Next, please. Okay, now the counter-revolution, right? Focuses on this, Collins gradually assuming broad powers, the pro-treaty alliance with the church and moneyed elites, the move towards a coercive state, the abandonment of the 1919 Democratic Reform Program, which was an important part of the Doyle's first message and was fairly socialist. So, the counter-revolution is sort of saying, no, we're giving the government way too much credit for being creative and innovative. In fact, what they did was they just went back to doing what was done by the British in order to stay in power. Next slide, please. And there you see, I tried to find this webpage because I found the link, but I couldn't. It said this webpage no longer exists, which makes me a little bit nervous. But I think that the photos give you a sense, right? This is Collins during the election of 1922. This is Collins in uniform. He almost never wore a uniform before the Civil War. In the Civil War, however, he suddenly gets very military. Just a thought. Next slide. The counter-argument, in Ireland in 1920, there just wasn't much of a support for a leftist revolution. And in fact, even within the Republican movement itself and the Doyle and the IRA, the number of leftists is a very small minority. So this idea that somehow a counter-revolution stopped, which could have been this incredibly progressive political movement, just doesn't seem very likely, simply on the basis of numbers. There's not much of an industrial base in the 26 counties of Ireland. And that's usually at this time where leftist revolutionaries are drawn from, right? The industrial proletariat, Marx, socialism, communism. There just aren't that many. There is a Labor Party, which we'll talk about in just a minute. The cooperative movements and the Soviets didn't get a lot of support. There were 200 Soviets declared in Ireland in 1921 and 22. But by and large, they were pretty small. And they didn't have a lot of public support, and they didn't last very long, right? It doesn't suggest that there's a groundswell of leftism sort of waiting to bubble up. And part of the reason for this is that British reforms before these wars had undercut some of the big social issues that might otherwise have led to revolution. But land reform, most of us are old enough to remember that in the Reagan administration, in El Salvador, land reform was a major issue. We pushed land reform as a solution to revolutionary forces in El Salvador because the peasants wanted land. As long as they desired land and couldn't get it, they were potentially dangerous revolutionaries. Land has already been given to most of the Irish farmers who want it, right? There's one more big bill in 1923. But that undercut a lot of potential ferment that might have led to a revolutionary environment. Next. All right, current historiography, just so you know where we are now, right? This is in the 2000s. Ireland was a flat, narrow place that lost the courage of its own revolution's convictions, a cruel, timid place that was hard on its weakest and too much in thrall of those who preached right from wrong. That's kind of the most damning kind of commentary in the counter-revolution. The editors of this book, which came out a few years ago, I think they get something here. Whatever their shortcomings, it seems fair to acknowledge that the state builders of 1922 saw themselves as implementing revolutionary ideals as they understood them. And that many politicians and people on both sides of the treaty divide shared conservative values that now elicit less admiration. Elicit less admiration. Very careful parsing of words, right? But measuring what was accomplished in 1922 by where we are now is fair in some ways, but it also may dismiss what was the art of the possible in 1922, which is what politics is unfortunately all about, right? Politics is about compromise and achieving what you can. Next slide. So what's missing? Well, here are some things. What would the British allow? What did the Irish people want, as opposed to Sinn Féin and the IRA? Some discussion of the limited appeal of anti-treaty efforts, some discussion of the limits of the revolutionary impulse in Ireland, and then maybe a discussion again of Ireland's democratic tradition and institutions. So I'm going to blitz through those quickly. But this is where I find more information that helps inform me about why the period ended the way it did. Thanks. Okay, so what would the British permit? Well, they did have both policies and leverage, right? The policies were they were going to give Dominion status, the Free State, with partition, which means Northern Ireland remains in the United Kingdom. The 6 counties of Northern Ireland have an independent parliament, which the British government really doesn't supervise much at all. They have their own security forces, but they're part of the United Kingdom. They won't give a United Ireland, and they won't give a republic. They will give a border commission to discuss the Northern Irish border. And this is something that the negotiators actually were probably placed too much stock in and were too optimistic about. But it looked as though the way it was worded, that they might be able to nick the counties of Tyrone and Fermanagh and maybe some area around Derry and some area in Armagh from the northern state through this border commission, because those were areas where the Catholic population was predominant and they had voted to be part of Ireland. They didn't want to be part of Northern Ireland. That didn't pan out well in 1925, but it was an argument for why you accepted what you could. They also had leverage. Some of these leverages are symbolic. Have any of you seen the movie Michael Collins? Right? You remember when they take over Dublin Castle and he shows up 7 minutes late and they scold him for it? He says, well, you've been here 700 years, you can wait a few damn minutes. But handing over the keys of Dublin Castle on the 16th of January, 1922, I mean, that's a huge symbol, right? What does that say to the Irish population all around the world? It says, the British have handed the castle to the Irish, right? That's powerful. That grants legitimacy to the new government. They withdraw troops, and they withdraw troops from the hinterlands as quickly as they can. They keep about 6,000 in Dublin, partly because that's the easiest place, or one of the easiest places to move troops from. So rather than having them out on the Curragh, have them in Dublin, but it's also leverage, right? As this process rolls on, they still have forces available. They hand over weapons to the Free State Army and at various times to the anti-treaty IRA. And they have an alternative. And this is something that I think the Irish just don't understand, both at the time and even looking back. The British government that negotiates the treaty is headed by David Lloyd George, who is a liberal. He runs a coalition government where 4/5 of his supporters are conservatives. And at this time, and I think even today, the Conservative Party in Great Britain is actually titled the Conservative and Unionist Party of the United Kingdom. The guy who's waiting he's waiting in the wings for Lloyd George to make a misstep is a guy named Andrew Bonar Law, who actually is a Canadian, but he's the leader of the Conservative Party. He's extremely hardline on Ireland. He didn't want to give up home rule. He didn't want to give up this deal. He wasn't sitting at the table when this deal was given up. And if he takes over, the possibility of a really significant coercive backlash against Ireland is very, very possible. He actually does end up in power in November 1922. But by that point, the Civil War is already broken out, so we don't know what his policy towards Ireland would have been. But if Lloyd George's government collapses, Bonar Law takes over. And he's a Margaret Thatcher, right? I mean, he's just not a nice man on Ireland. Next. What do the Irish people want? Well, as everybody's pointed out, they did vote for Sinn Féin twice. It's important to put that in context. In 1918, the Irish Parliamentary Party, the Home Rule Party, which they had always voted for, was thoroughly discredited because Home Rule had failed. I mean, they'd gotten the bill through, but then they postponed it until the end of the war, and then they insisted that it would be a partitioned Ireland rather than a united Ireland, and the Irish Parliamentary Party just looks worse and worse and worse, and Sinn Féin is the alternative. And Sinn Féin comes out, and they're loud and they're brash, and most importantly, they're right about conscription, because they say throughout the war, the British are going to try and impose conscription on Ireland. They're going to take all our young men away and bleed them to death in the field of Flanders. And in March 1918, the British government do announce that they are going to impose conscription on Ireland. They pass the law, but then never impose conscription. They never conscript anybody. But that gives Sinn Féin a whole lot of vigor, because they can say, look, we told you this was going to happen. They were going to come after our kids. And so Sinn Féin is actually riding very high in 1918. Those votes in 1918 are votes for Sinn Féin candidates, who, by the way, are handpicked by the Irish Republican Brotherhood. But they're also in some ways a protest vote, right? You're voting for the guys who will stick it in the eyes of the guys that you used to vote for but weren't doing what you needed, right? In 1921, all the constituencies are run unopposed. And you're in the middle of a war, and Sinn Féin are the good guys. So yes, they're going to get a whole lot of support. But does that mean the Irish population really was voting on the Republic? Because that's the argument of the anti-treaty group. A better mechanism for thinking about this is probably the municipal vote in 1920, in January. This is before British coercion moves into sort of full force. 1,806 members elected to municipal bodies, 550 are Sinn Féin, 394 are Labour, 355 are Unionists, 238 are Nationalists, 108 are ratepayers, and 161 are Independent. In a reasonably free vote, fewer than a third of the votes are cast for Sinn Féin. All right? Now, that doesn't mean Sinn Féin isn't the dominant party. It just may mean that the Irish people aren't as fixated on the Republic as they are on things like rates. Right? Just something to think about. Next slide, please. And Arthur Griffith, I think here, hits the nail on the head. He gave this interview before he died. It wasn't published until the 31st of August. He died on the 12th. He said, the Irish people want peace. They even want peace to the extent of accepting an alliance with Britain. Now, he's the head of the Free State government. You don't have to believe him, but that's his rationale for doing the things that he's doing. He says, he's talking to the Irish people want peace, not war. And the anti-treaty position is offering war, not peace. Right? That may be one way of thinking about this, and thinking about how to understand what the Irish wanted at this time. Next slide. Also, there's some limited appeal to anti-treaty efforts. Republicanism is a minority view linked with violence, right? It is the major alternative for nationalism after home rule dies. But after a truce and a period of peace for 6 months, republicanism may not look as appealing as continuing the peace, right, to the Irish Republic in general. The treaty was reached through a democratic process. There was a vote by the negotiators, there was a vote by the cabinet, there was a vote in public debate in the Dáil. And the anti-treaty efforts are really divided. They try and paint themselves as a united front, but in this case, they're literally all over the place. It's just people who don't like the treaty. Next slide. Right? The seizure of the four courts, by the way, caused a general strike by the Labour Party to protest against militarism. They're protesting, Labour is protesting against the anti-treaty IRA, which again is a tidbit of evidence that that leftist revolutionary coalition may not actually exist, right? That it may instead be different interests and different concerns. You've got some people want to renegotiate the treaty, right? That's De Valera, the most famous figure in the anti-treaty movement. And Cathal Brugha, again, a hero and one of the most famous figures in the anti-treaty movement. Next slide. But you also have a bunch of other guys whose real focus is to preserve the Republic, but mostly to preserve the IRA. And in this, they have something in common with some of the leaders of the emerging Free State. Mulcahy wants to preserve the IRA. Collins wants to preserve the IRA. The IRB wants to preserve the IRA. The question is who's going to control it and what's it going to do? These guys want an independent IRA. Lynch becomes the leader of the anti-treaty IRA in the Civil War once it breaks out. Deasy becomes one of the leaders until he's captured in January. O'Donoghue, who is the head of intelligence in Cork and was a leading intellectual figure, chooses neutrality. He says, I hate the treaty, but I'm not going to kill Irishmen over it. And he writes one of the best books from this generation, No Other Law, is really a terrific book if you want to try and get a sense of what people at that time who lived through a great deal of this were feeling. It's an extraordinary book. Next slide. And then you had the radicals, and these are the guys that people keep talking about when they talk about Republican militarism. These are the guys who seized the four courts. Liam Mellows was about as socialist as anybody in the IRA. O'Connor, you've already heard from, talking about military dictatorship. O'Malley was one of the great leaders of the IRA in the War of Independence, less effective in the Civil War. Oscar Traynor, the head of the Dublin Brigade, who wants to, all of these guys basically want to start a war with Britain. Because they think, look, we can't let the treaty go through. The only way to prevent it is to start a war with Britain. We're going to have to make that happen, whether the people like it or not. Next slide. There's also limited appeal to revolution at this time. There were leftist, and when we say leftist, we basically mean communist with a capital C, revolutions in Eastern Europe at the end of the First World War. They were facilitated by the collapse of empires, so entire governmental systems collapsed. There was nothing left. And from the ashes, something new had to be built. New states like Czechoslovakia, which used to be Bohemia, which was a mixture of Czechs and Slovaks, which is a real mess, as we found out a century later, right? Because now there's a Czech Republic and a Slovak Republic. Anyway, that was really messy. And leftist politics were one way of uniting and creating enough coercive capability to create a state. And there were revolutions that were won and lost at enormous social and economic cost. The Russian Revolution we know about ends up with Lenin in power. About 10 million people died. That's about 1 in 16. If that happens in Ireland in 1922, that's about 250,000 dead. Now, the actual number of dead in Ireland in the War of Independence and the Civil War is about 4,000. Right? So we're talking orders of magnitude worse if you have that kind of social revolution. The closest example to Ireland is Finland, right? Which was part of the Russian Empire, detaches, it was an independent duchy, it detaches whole cloth. They have a battle between communists and the whites, the usual elites of Finland. About 40,000 people die in that war. And it has a population roughly the same as Ireland's. So those are really ugly revolutionary wars. And people are looking at these things. And while sometimes they look at them with sort of rosy-colored glasses, gee, the Russian Revolution looks like a really great thing because the Tsar's gone. Sometimes they dig into the details and they say, oh my God, I can't believe that's happening, and I'm so glad it's not happening here. Next slide. Why didn't this happen in Ireland? Well, one reason is a lack of ruthlessness. And for all we talk about the valor and sometimes the bloodthirstiness of members of the IRA and the Free State Army and people in Ireland at this time, they were not ruthless the way that Lenin was. They were not ruthless the way that doctrinaire communists were. They weren't willing to kill anybody who stood in their way. And that's a blessing, right? This is Mulcahy while he's in prison in 1917. And by the way, I've had people come up and say, he never said that, he never said that. I can show you the citations of people who heard him say that. You don't have to believe them. Shoot them and be damned to them if they're not with you, right? Once he got into power, however, he was much more temperate. Now, he did support the reprisal killings, the 7th of December, the 4 leaders of the 4 courts. He was one of the key people to make that happen. He was not an innocent by any stretch of the imagination, but at the same time, he didn't approve much wider use of assassination or execution. And in 1924, when the army was threatening to mutiny, he not only stepped in to stop it, but when the government came to him and said, this is unacceptable, he said, I will resign my commission, right? A ruthless military dictator would have shot Kevin O'Higgins in the face, right? So these guys have depth and breadth, all of them, but there's a lack of that ruthlessness that you find in Eastern Europe. Next slide. And I think part of the reason for that is Ireland had democratic traditions, and they stuck, right? Dating back a century or more, they had democratic traditions, they had a history of constitutional nationalism, they had a history of working through democracy to achieve some effective political change, and those institutions stuck. And I want to walk you through it, because this is a hypothesis, but I think it's reasonable. Now, Sinn Féin didn't have a lot of experience governing, but they leaned on these institutions and traditions. The first thing they do, they form a Dáil. What's a Dáil? It's a parliament. What's it based on? A democratic election. They set up ministries. Those ministries are supposed to do things for the people. Some of them do, some of them don't. But they try and function like a government. They have experience in government. They try and imitate that experience and do it independently. The local elections are a touchstone of Irish rural and urban life. That's one of the reasons the municipal elections in 1920, I think, are important, right? But all through the 19th century, you have this tradition of we can have elections, those elections have meaning, the party that is elected then will get to do things for us. Even the IRB and the IRA have democratic traditions in weird ways. The IRB has this weird democratic effort that creates leadership, but it does mean that everybody in the IRB, at least in theory, is getting votes on who's going to be in charge and can affect policy. The IRA has an army executive, which is resurrected in 1922 at the convention where the anti-treaty IRA basically declares its independence from the Dáil. So These are all part of creating a sense of both public and elite confidence in self-governance. And I think that's important. If you believe that you can govern yourself, it means you can work. So next slide. The Doyle and democracy, right? The Doyle actually can't function very effectively during the War of Independence. They only meet about a dozen times. Once the war is over, once the truce has occurred, however, they begin meeting much more frequently and trying to act like a normal parliament, right? With like Robert's Rules of Orders and all the other stuff, but also to function as a representative body. Sinn Féin is run as a cabinet government because De Valera likes it that way. He has control. He stacks the cabinet with his friends, and then he makes things work. Hey, this is another form of governance, but the treaty, one of his allies, William Cosgrave, defects and says, no, wait a minute. The negotiators signed a treaty. It's supposed to go before the Doyle. So, De Valera, I don't care that you're offended. This is the right thing to do. This is democracy in action. De Valera considers it a desertion. Some of the Republicans feel it's a betrayal, but this is the way democracy is supposed to work. And then the treaty debate is a democratic process. They have initially a brief open debate, and then they say, we've got to go into closed session for a couple of days. And when they go into closed session for a couple of days, the military leadership of the IRA is talking to the members of the Doyle. They're saying, we can't really win this thing, and the treaty gives us more than we have now. So we should probably take it. That's our political judgment. Our military judgment is we can't win this thing on the ground. When people went home for Christmas, they actually went out and talked to their constituents. And that was important because a lot of the folks who were members of Parliament were also members of the IRA, and they were spending a lot of time on the run. They weren't really doing constituent work. They had kind of other priorities. They go and they talk to their constituents and they find out that a lot of their constituents really want peace. And this definitely changes votes in the Doyle vote. When they come back in January, some votes have changed. The church, newspapers, and elites play a powerful role. This is part of the narrative of the counter-revolution, but it's also what happens in democracies, right? Elected representatives are supposed to go and talk to their constituents, and they're supposed to talk to all of their constituents. And the church has a powerful voice in Ireland at this time. Elites and newspapers have powerful voices as well. Next slide. So the Doyle decisions demonstrate democracy in action, right? They have a 64-57 vote in favor. And again, let me remind you, all these people are basically wild-eyed radicals, right? Everybody who's taken a vote here has been handpicked by the highest levels of the Republican organizations and has been vetted for ideological purity, and they are making a really tough choice between being pragmatic, between being idealistic. Do we vote for a republic that we may never see, or do we vote for something solid that we then can work with? And the vote is close, but it's 64-57. Griffith then is voted in as the new president of the Doyle over De Valera, right? So there is now a peaceful constitutional transfer of power as a new party and head of state takes place. Again, all symbols of democracy. Now, at that point it gets murky, right? But you have this that you can look at, right? You can say, this is how come we got the treaty. You now have three separate institutions which are formed to government, and this is government, and this is, how do I say it? This is Britain's fault, right? They don't recognize the Doyle. They just don't. They say there is no Doyle. There is a parliament that was elected for Southern Ireland in 1921. Now, just because you call it the Doyle doesn't make it the Doyle, and we don't recognize the Doyle, we recognize the parliament. So it has to meet. So it meets. And basically what happens is all of the pro-treaty members of parliament, that's what TD means, members of the Doyle, plus the four sad members, who are not Sinn Féin because they're professors at Trinity College Dublin, which for some reason gets to elect 4 representatives. Old style. Anyway, they meet once, have tea, and they never meet again. But technically they're the formal body, and what ends up happening is there's a provisional government that gets set up, headed by Collins. So Griffith's in charge of the Doyle. The Doyle makes decisions for Ireland that Britain doesn't accept, so Collins has to then translate them in ways to Britain that will allow the British to accept those decisions. It's really complicated, it's really stupid, but it's life. However, there's a need for an early election. You have to have an election in June 1922, which is supposed to be a thumbs up or down on the treaty. Because on December 6, 1922, the Free State, the new Dominion, will be created, and there has to be a government in power that has accepted the treaty. So the June election is a forcing function, right? Everything swirls around this. And the other thing that it swirls around is the Constitution. Because what Collins does is he takes like 8 guys, and they're guys, women aren't allowed in this party, and he puts them in a room, and he says, make me a constitution. And he says, by the way, make it a Republican constitution, but one that will somehow slip under the radar. There was no radar then. I'm mixing my metaphors. That somehow Lloyd George won't be able to figure out that it's a Republican constitution. And so they spend a lot of time and they put together a Republican constitution and they send it to the British, and the British are like, they get the red pen out and they're lining stuff out, and they call Griffith and Collins to London and they chew them out. And they say, you are gonna write a constitution that basically replicates the treaty. And that's what gets passed. That's what gets created in June, just before the June elections. Next slide, please. Now, these elections are interesting. This is it's an eye chart. Orange, sadly, this is a poor choice. Orange means pro-treaty, and green means anti-treaty. Okay, now, just don't think that. It's just, this is from the University of Leicester, so they probably didn't think it through. Anyway, it gives you an idea though, right? The pro-treaty vote is substantially larger than the anti-treaty vote. And in most areas except the Southwest and the Far West, which are Republican strongholds, the pro-treaty does pretty well. What's interesting here is you have a substantial vote for labor, and the percentage of the vote is as big as the percentage of the anti-treaty vote. And you have a substantial vote for the Farmers' Party. So people aren't, the best way to interpret these results, I think, is that about 22% of the country is really focused on opposition to the treaty. And the rest of the country has other things that they want to know about, right? That's sort of interesting, and it comes out 10 days before the Civil War begins on June 28th, right? So it gives you some idea of where the country's at. Next slide. Now, we go to 1923, after the Civil War is over. I couldn't find an identical chart, so I apologize, but these charts will be available to you. James has them if you want them. Pro-treaty crept up a little bit. Anti-treaty, even though they just lost the Civil War, anti-treaty jumps a bunch. They went from 22 to 27% of the vote. Labor dumps, right? They lose 50% of their votes, and the Farmers' Party goes way up. Now, again, what that means, well, the anti-treaty vote, at least some of it is, people don't like the government, right? The pro-treaty party is now the government. People don't like the government. There was a civil war. Everybody knows somebody who's gotten imprisoned or shot, right? That there are good reasons for the anti-treaty vote to go up. But it also tells you something about this balance of this idea of left-wing politics. Labor dumps vote to the farmers, right? And to the anti-treaty group. Not clear, this is evidence that this idea of a leftist social revolution lurking out there somewhere that didn't happen just doesn't seem to really be borne out by the statistics. These are the kinds of electoral posters you had when De Valera comes back out of the dark and creates the Fianna Fáil party, which runs for election in 1927 and then eventually becomes the majority party in government in 1932. The pro-treaty guys are saying, De Valera and all of his henchmen are terrorists. And De Valera and all of his friends are saying, these guys counter-revolution, right? They're giving all the money to the rich people, they're pounding it to the poor, they're being terrible. That's what elections looked like in 1927, 1932. Next slide. I think though, here adding an institutional explanation gives us something, right? Leaders default to existing institutions that they trust. And what happens is, basically, there's a bunch of institutions out there, and the British withdraw and the Irish step in, right? There's a parliament that's supposed to be governing things. It's in London, but now we're gonna have one in Dublin, okay? Irish step in and become the parliament and begin governing because it's comfortable, because they kind of know how this works, and because it's been around for 100 years. This is a process we can trust. What is the alternative? Something very different. What would that be? Nobody knows, right? So you just step in and fill the place. The courts, right? Keep a bunch of the same judges, replace a few, keep the same court system. Civil service, keep them all on. Add a few more to leaven the batch, right? This is sort of what's happening, is that institutions are just being turned over to the Irish. And in a way that makes sense if what you have to do is make a state run in a year, right? They have to have in December something that works so that they can create a free state. And just segueing into things that they're familiar and comfortable with isn't either betrayal or irrational. It's kind of normal. Social revolution, I think, is prevented by, to some extent, British reforms. They tried to undercut some of the potential causes of social revolution. An acceptance of the handover of power and the preservation of existing institutions. General public acceptance of the new government, which you see in the elections. Lack of public support for revolutionary efforts, which again, you see not only with the anti-treaty party, but also movements by the communists to try and do things don't get a lot of support. And again, that lack of ruthlessness on the part of anti-treaty actions. But because it's a democracy also, you get this unique situation where the government wins. It wins by having to use coercion, which many states use in different ways, but it pays a price for it. And within 10 years, it is replaced at the polls by the people it defeated, which again, is just such a fascinating outcome. Next slide. And through a constitutional process again. My conclusion, Civil War is about the birth of a modern state. It wasn't really about the birth of a nation. The Irish nation is something much bigger. That's the way that the Irish nation was always talked about. It's the diaspora as well, right? And it's not a republic. It's certainly not a 32-county republic. There wasn't much that could be done about that, given the treaty and the war. It's not a revolutionary regime. It's also not a colonial outpost under new management, which is what it was critiqued for being. But it's a little bit of all of these, right? When we think about it, the Irish Revolution looks a lot more like the American Revolution. You have a change of the people who govern and how they view the world and the way in which they are allowed to articulate themselves in the world. But you don't have a lot of immediate change in institutions. Court systems go on after the American Revolution the way that they did under the British. Policing, militias, all of these institutions that existed, they simply turn over to new leadership. You have a working constitution, and the Americans decide after about a decade that it's not going to work, and then they come up with a better one, which is the one that we're still working with today. The same thing happens in Ireland, right? Now, they have a constitution in 1922. By the time De Valera is elected in 32, he's doing everything he can to undermine it and write a new one, and he does in 1937. And the Free State becomes ERA, an independent state. Okay? Thankfully, it looks a lot less like the Russian Revolution. Again, the Russian Revolution, chaos, revolutionaries seize power, they impose a form of government that is driven by their own ideology and expand it across hundreds of millions of people, and then they radically alter society and the political system at enormous social and economic cost. So overall, Ireland actually did very well out of this, I would argue. And I think the reason for it is, again, compared to post-colonial states after 1945, there was so much more in the way of institutions and infrastructure that already existed that they could use, that allowed them to move in and govern fairly effectively in a way that most people accepted because of the democratic tradition. Those things didn't exist in most of the post-colonial states that emerged after 1945. They had to create them from whole cloth. They had to create new systems. And that is always expensive, costly, and bloody. And with that, thank you for your time. I'll take any questions you have. Sir?
Do you think that one of the reasons why they weren't as ruthless had something to do with their Christian, the Christianity that they practice, either Protestant or Catholic, where they wouldn't be prone to as much violence because they wanted to be able to honor Christ by being more peaceable?
That's a great question. There's some good work out there on the impact of Christian belief on the volunteers, the IRA. I'm not sure it's terribly conclusive, but I think it absolutely does have an impact. We know that when the church intervened in certain ways at key times, like when the church in October of 1922 denies communion and sacraments to anybody who's with the anti-treaty forces. That has a powerful impact on at least some of the members of the anti-treaty IRA. They feel like they've been literally cut off from God, and they reconsider their positions. In the testimony at the Bureau of Military History, the witness statements, and some of the pension statements now that are emerging, the military service pension collection, people are honest, shockingly honest, about, I killed this man and then I had nightmares about it for decades. That for some, killing was really, really difficult. For others, it appears to have been easier. And this reflects a spectrum of the population, I guess. But I do think that Christianity had something to do with it, and especially the devotion of the average Irishman in 1920. The Catholic Church in Ireland was very different, and devotion required an awful lot of obedience, and it was a very different connection, I think, than Christianity in much of the Western world today. It's hard to evaluate because we're not there, but I think it was a powerful and important part of conscience and moral consideration. Hope that answered.
Yeah, it would just make sense that if you had deep religious convictions, you're not going to want to kill your neighbor or whatever like that, because you realize that they're made in the image and likeness of God. So you have a little hesitation there to do that.
Well, I believe we have eyewitness testimony when Collins first summoned the assassination squad in Dublin, that he brought about a dozen people in, and he said, look, we're going to ask you to start shooting people. We're going to need you to kill policemen. And if you don't think you can do that, then you should go now, and nothing will be held against you. Because we know that some people won't be able to do that, but the people that we need for this particular mission set are people who don't have that feeling. And we know that in Ireland at various times, volunteers turned down missions or didn't show for reasons of conscience. So it certainly played some role. Other questions? James?
You just following up on that, I tend to look at it like these were all Christians going at it, and it is all Christians, until very recently going at it. And how much people were held back by the Christianity is something that, would be a subject of a book, I guess.
But probably several.
And it depends who writes the book.
Yeah.
But basically on the overall presentation here, it's my, concern, or my activism in my adult life has been with the 6 counties, the petition, the provos, etc., the, civil rights movement and everything like that. Again, all Christians going at it in a way that, denied people basic rights. But the comparison to the American Revolution, it seems to me like we have these documents, like we got the proclamation up here, which expands rights to women for the first time.
Right.
We have the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. And then we have the reality of what actually takes place where, we had a civil war here because, hey, I guess all men aren't really created equal. And over in Ireland, the 2 governments, the 6 county government, the 26 county government, was so conservative and pushed things so far backwards from the ideals of the revolution. Now, your presentation is brilliant and in depth, but you can see how it's easy to put idealism, and smash it with the realism of power and money and authority. And I think that's what happened in both countries and many other countries around the world.
Yeah, again, I'm not saying there couldn't have been a better outcome, right? I'm not sure there could have been as good an outcome as some people think there might have been, some kind of social revolution. But absolutely, look, the fact that the new provisional government, which later becomes the Free State government, comes into being through a bloodbath, right? First the attack on the four courts, and then later on December 7th, the reprisal killings. There's no way in the midst of a civil war that group of people is going to be thinking about progressive concerns. They're not going to be stepping out of the box. They're going to do everything they can to win the civil war. And I think that's one of the reasons they adopt some reforms they do, and that things slide backwards so quickly for women in the Free State. The Proclamation and the Declaration of Independence, I mean, we chose in the Declaration of Independence to immediately devalue a whole bunch of people who lived in the United States, because we had to, for political reasons. Right? We had to, again, there was that political trade-off. You needed to pass the Declaration of Independence with the vote of all 14 colonies, and you were not going to get North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia on board, unless you permitted slavery. So, very idealistic document that was tainted from the beginning. Proclamation, maybe not tainted from the beginning, but in the execution it becomes really problematic. Again, because of the events that are occurring. I think the other thing, and this is something that the commemoration committees for the centennial thought about a lot, is that the Americans, we can point at a date and say, this was our Independence Day, right? It was July 4th, 1776, because that document was created. Boom. In Ireland, you have competing narratives. Is the date of independence that day, right, when the proclamation is posted? Is it January 20th, 1919, when the Dáil meets as an all-Irish parliament for the first time? Is it January 7th, 1922, when the treaty is approved by the Dáil that creates a free state? Is it December 6th, 1922, when the Free State actually comes into being? That's a long time. It's harder to focus on what's the day that Ireland really emerged. And they didn't know how to answer that, which is one of the reasons they held a party for 10 years with all of these commemorative meetings, which were, by the way, were fascinating. And a lot of good work has come out that has really, I think, changed. I'm not an Irish historian by trade. I do a bunch of other things as well as this. But it's really fundamentally changed, I think, the way that we look, especially at the role of women in the revolution. I think that is something that, since about 2000, that window has really opened a great deal. Some people are worried it's gone too far. I don't really care. I just think it's fascinating, right? People are starting to study the role that women played, because that role was circumscribed in history almost deliberately after the end of the Civil War. So I think that's really fascinating. Please.
Just wanted to add, you said there's lessons to be learned here for other nations going through
Yep.
similar circumstances. In a nutshell, like, what are those lessons? What can we take away and offer to other countries?
I think it's going to have to be on a case-by-case basis,
Yeah.
right? Because every society is different. But you want to find, if you are concerned about preventing the most violent types of revolution, then you have to try and find existing institutions, existing infrastructure, existing traditions that you can work with people to build their own future out of. And I can give you a good and a bad example of our recent adventures in Afghanistan. Okay, we didn't know a lot about Afghanistan. Not very many people know a lot about Afghanistan, but there are some very smart people who are working for the U.S. government who knew something about Afghanistan. What we did early on, right, the Taliban had been defeated, we summoned a loya jirga, which is the kind of thing that doesn't happen very often. It's a tribal council, it's a big deal, it's very Afghan, and we tried to stay out of it and let them work out their business. That was partly successful. And then we found ourselves, I think, feeling crunched for time. And we'd already kind of decided that Hamid Karzai was going to be the head of Afghanistan. And so we just kind of made him the head of Afghanistan. And then a few years later, then we invaded Iraq and didn't pay attention to Afghanistan for a few years, or at least it wasn't a priority. A few years later, we came back. And now we're faced with this Afghanistan, which is threatened by the Taliban again, which is a very traditional institution, but we're not going to negotiate with them because you can't negotiate with terrorists. Right? Already a problem. But more importantly, we've created these institutions for them. We've created elections. We're trying to build something that they can have faith in. And one of the first things that the Obama administration does in Afghanistan in 2009 is to delay the election. Because Karzai was going to get elected again, and there were a lot of people in the American administration that didn't like Karzai, and they wanted time to come up with an alternate candidate, right? So we tried to use sort of traditional methods, discarded those, bad idea, tried to create additional new institutions for them, and then we turned back and looked at them, we said, well, we don't like what that turned out, so let's break it. That's the way not to do things. The way to do things, I think, probably be more sticking with the loya jirga. Might have made more use out of the king. We encouraged the king of Afghanistan to abdicate. He hadn't been in country for 20 or 30 years, but that doesn't mean that he might not have played a better use if we had been thinking about what do they want. And one of the most important things is to talk to them about what they want. And this, I think, is something we see in the Irish case a little bit. There are a lot of people saying they know what the Irish people want, but you only find out, basically, I think, in the Doyle debate when people go home and start talking to their constituents, right? That's how they start figuring out, oh my gosh, maybe this treaty is something we kind of have to take. And I think that's how most of the people who supported the treaty expressed themselves in the vote. They said, look, we don't have a lot of choice here. We've got to, this is something meaningful and our people want it. And we should do it and then figure out, and then Collins offered this thing about the stepping stone. Yeah, that's going to be kind of our explanation for why we did it. And then there were a lot of people who were just like, nope, we can't do it, right? This is what we are pledged to, and we can never walk away from it. No other law, right? It's Flory O'Donoghue's book is titled. It's a really tragic moment for Ireland. On the other hand, again, I'm just struck with how it ended. That 10 years later, the guys who are willing to fight to prevent the treaty become a political party under a new treaty government, win the election, and then work to use constitutional processes to undermine the treaty. That's very unusual. Now, I think we've sort of seen that in some countries more recently. We've seen former guerrilla parties in El Salvador and Colombia have become fairly powerful through democratic processes. It's just, again, it's kind of unusual that it would happen so quickly and so completely. And by the way, back to the militarism debate, the head of the police under the pro-treaty government, Owen O'Duffy, he was almost willing to wage a coup in 1932 to keep De Valera out of power. And there was another guy who'd been a spy for Collins who was also willing to maybe start a coup to keep De Valera out of power. And they both decided not to. But then O'Duffy formed a fascist organization called Blue Shirts. So there was militarism on both sides. There's a lot of electoral violence and sort of genial rioting in 1935 and 1936. So even though these guys were political, they still had that itch to scratch from time to time. So it's just a really interesting case. You have to forgive me, this is my hobby bordering on an obsession.
Yeah, thank you. It is so interesting to hear your perspectives, and it opens my mind to other thoughts as well.
Well, now the other
Always
thing, yeah,
interesting, yeah.
the other thing I'll say, because you're here, I don't talk about the North here at all.
Yeah.
Because this is not a Northern process, right? This is what happened in the Free State. The North's a whole different story. Not sure I'm ready to go there yet, but I will eventually. My experience in the North is in the 1980s, which is even different from the 1920s.
Yeah, yeah.
Other questions, comments? All right, thank you.
Thank you again, Tim.
Hey, glad to.
Great to hear he's got a book coming out, right? So we're gonna have a book signing at the.
By the way, James has my slides if you're interested in them, as always.
Okay, the slides will be up on email on our YouTube page. Just a couple of things here. We have a raffle going on back here. The raffle is not so much for our committee here, but rather we pay for the music that you're going to enjoy downstairs when we go down. And
I just want to, I'm giving the lecture next month. I'd like to follow that act.
that's why we
Be
thank
nice
you,
to me.
Pat. Yeah, please come and hear a whole other type of lecture. But listen, downstairs there's music, in the cafe, there's revolution in the air, and we can all enjoy the crack down there for a little while. Please come back, don't forget the steak fry, don't forget Island the band, and the lecture's coming up. Thank you so much for coming, and thank Professor Hoyt for another great night. Oh, and please, leave the chair. We will